The lighting's bad. The seats are bad.
I don't know if I should give the customary 10 minutes that they gave to me in graduate school to get on time. Hey, Steve. Get started. And want to thank everybody very much for coming out today. I'm really kind of flattered and humbled by having this opportunity and by the turnout here. My name is Chassy. I work for Catholic Relief Services. I've been working with Catholic Relief Services for just a bit over 5 years. And I had the opportunity to meet Chris, I don't know, 3 years ago or something like that. And just really pleased as punch to have this opportunity to be here.
I get to welcome you.
Oh, golly, I just welcomed myself. I'm sorry.
Their luncheon, but
Okay.
I have a feeling it's going to be a full house.
Okay.
Wonderful. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for making your way over here. My name is Chris Cervanek. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Civil and Human Rights. And we are honored to have our speaker, Chassy of Catholic Relief Services, with us today. I don't know if you went over this, Aaron. It's a minor miracle.
I didn't mention miracles. Nope.
Yesterday, despite all the cancellations, he made it from Baltimore via Detroit. And we just hope that we won't need a miracle to get you on. Aaron's visit to Notre Dame is hosted by the Center for Civil and Human Rights and the Kellogg Institute, and it contributes to a formal relationship that the University of Notre Dame has with Catholic Relief Services. So Mr. Chassy is a specialist in good governance and civil society with nearly 25 years of experience, 8 of which have been overseas in places like South Africa, South Sudan, and Mali. He has designed and managed programs in over 30 countries worldwide, as well as in the United States. And he earned his master's in public policy from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. He studied at the London School of Economics and has his bachelor's in economics and African studies from the University of Michigan. Mr. Chassy is now CRS's Director for Technical Integration, where he applies best practices and lessons learned to increase integration of peace building, governance, gender, education, and water resource development into CRS's programs. In the midst of all these urgent professional demands, Mr. Chassy takes time to reflect, analyze, and share lessons about key aspects of his work in international development, and his many publications address issues of peace building, governance, and aid. And they include an essay in an upcoming Cornell University Institute of African Development volume on aid effectiveness, upon which his lecture today is based. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Aaron Chassy.
Is this on? Can you all hear me? Yeah. Excellent. As I was mentioning earlier, Chris and I met, what was it, 2010?
Yes.
And so almost 4 years ago. And I'm just really tickled to have the chance to come back here, finally make good on our initial conversation about collaboration and meet some wonderful people here in the faculty and the students, and to have an opportunity to share some of my experiences with you. And so really this might look like a lecture. I guess it is a lecture hall, but it really shouldn't be experienced as a lecture. And I want to invite all of you to go ahead and throw in some questions as I'm going along. Obviously, we've only got so much time, so be mindful of that. And we'll do some more back and forth, some dialogue, I think, at the end of the presentation. But if you have any, points of information you want to clarify, feel free to jump in, and I'll do my best to clarify things for you. Okay, so let me grab this little clicker, and we'll get started. Hopefully, I'll get this right. This presentation, as Chris alluded, is based on some work that I've done previously and that I'm going to have in an upcoming publication. But really it's based on a lot of observations that I've had from my own experience working both overseas and working with international development organizations right here in the United States. And so I just wanted to share some of those experiences with you. Because this presentation is about aid effectiveness, we need to look at some of the frameworks that are already out there and that continue to be developed. The main one that you might have heard is in 2005 there was the Paris Declaration of Principles of Aid Effectiveness. And what I have up on this particular slide are just some of my own personal observations. And the thing to appreciate too is the Paris Declaration and the subsequent high-level fora were for government actors only. Government actors only. And then quickly, soon thereafter, during the subsequent meetings that they had elsewhere in Accra and most recently in Busan, there was an insistence by civil society to be included in this whole process. And so you had what were largely parallel processes going on where civil society would come in and dialogue about these kinds of issues. And this is not dissimilar from what we've seen over the past 2 decades, starting with the Rio Summit, the so-called Earth Summit in 1992, where NGOs, as civil society was lumped into being called, had their own sort of parallel effort along the way. And I think in the past 2 decades, almost, 3 decades, we realize that, and we appreciate that there's been more of a convergence so that it isn't these parallel tracks, but civil society is becoming more formally and more included in these processes. Even so, I would say, for me, the most important observation that I had about these kinds of discussions is that rather than talk about aid effectiveness, which is really the sort of delivery, the operations of development assistance, let's talk about the ideas behind that. Let's talk about development effectiveness. So when we talk about civil society, first of all, before we get into civil society and development effectiveness, there are a lot of competing narratives that are out there. And I think, for me, the big takeaway is civil society, just like how it's often referred to, social capital, can be a double-edged sword. And so we need to recognize that civil society can contribute both to positive development outcomes as well as some of the less favorable ones that development is supposed to be addressing in the first place, especially when you're looking in the context of violent conflict and some of the kinds of social and economic cleavages that drive or are the root causes of conflict. And that gets to the last observation there, where even civil society in its various manifestations can actually bring about and be a driver for violent conflict rather than being this sort of nice do-gooder bringing together a people through associations and all the sort of de Tocquevillian or Robert Putnam-esque understandings of what civil society can and should do. Obviously, if we do want civil society to be contributing to development, and in particular to effective and I would say equitable development, there are a lot of challenges associated with that. And what I'm going to show you in the next couple slides are a few of those challenges as I've seen them both in the literature and also in my own personal or professional experience. The first of which is probably something you all are very familiar with, studying and working in international development, is the instrumentalized use of civil society. Civil society organizations might be called partners, but really often they're being asked to serve a particular purpose, usually a projectized purpose, to help achieve a finite set of objectives, rather than, I would say, strengthening the institution of civil society in the larger set of institutions of democracy and governance. We also see that, especially now as international development policy shifts towards local ownership and local implementation, there's a bit of competitiveness, and this is nothing new actually, between the global north and the global south. So particularly groups like mine, Catholic Relief Services, the private voluntary organizations, or more generally we're referred to as international NGOs, and the host country or the indigenous civil society organizations. And based on my previous point, this notion of instrumentalized use of civil society, oftentimes we see that civil society organizations, whether they're sub-awardees or as working as individual consultants, they're seen as more economic actors or businesses. And in fact, that leads to the last point on this slide, which is the point I've been making all along. We're not about strengthening the institution of civil society. Rather, it's what can they do to help us achieve our particular donor-driven objectives. Some of the other challenges, this is the first one there is much larger policy level, and this came to the forefront, I think, especially over the previous decade under the Bush administration, where under the sort of rubric of this global war on terror, we had what we called the 3 Ds of foreign policy. Anybody remember what those 3 Ds were? Crunch, crunch, munch, munch. Yes, sir.
Defense, development, diplomacy.
Awesome, exactly. Which was based upon a policy paper on fragile states that came out around about 2005 that set out that we needed to have a whole of government approach as set by these 3 Ds. Well, what did you say? Diplomacy, defense, and development? Where's democracy in all that? Well, it wasn't. And even though there was actually a big ramp up of democracy spending, just like the use of civil society, it was also instrumentalized to be able to achieve the strategic, more geostrategic objectives of U.S. foreign policy, rather than strengthening the institutions of democracy and governance, which gave democracy promotion, frankly, a really bad name. And we're still trying to crawl out from underneath that rock, however many years later. But more particular to what we're seeing in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, and one could even say in northern Africa, we're not dealing with democracies really, or even democracies in waiting. Really, we're dealing with a situation that Dallos and Chaban have talked about as the instrumentalization of disorder. I know I'm using that I word a lot, but it's, again, the sort of manipulation of good intents for not such good purposes. And so you have the sort of floating superstructure, to use Joran Haydn's term from about 30 odd years ago, of the state that are being imposed upon institutional foundations that are not at all correlated or consistent with the experience that we had in developing our institutions of governance, the sort of Iberian state and all that good stuff from the European traditions. And so you really have this disconnect. That's not to say African countries aren't capable of democracy. That's not to say democracy is inappropriate. It's just you can't just copy and paste our historical and cultural experience from hundreds of years in the making onto countries that have just been forming over the last 50 to 60 years. And it's not just a question of, well, you need to give them more time. More time based on what? Based on their own historical and cultural experiences. You might come up with something very different, which gets to a lot of these other issues that I'm listing here, which are symptomatic of what I'm describing. In many of these semi-authoritarian regimes, you have limited voice for citizens and for civil society. And frankly, because of, again, the sort of state-to-state nature of Paris Declaration and subsequent fora, you don't really have any kind of, downward accountability where these governments are being told, look, you've got to meet a certain floor or threshold of respecting human and civil rights before, we're going to be able to have these discussions on, if you will, the mechanics of delivering good development outcomes, okay? And then lastly, even if you were to have some sort of parallel effort by civil society to contribute to this kind of discussion, often within these countries, because these authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes are so insecure, they feel a constant need to shut down any avenues for political competition. And political competition, I'm defining more broadly to be more than just, competition between particular political parties, but really the balance of power between both the state and society. I'm probably taking a bit too long. I ought to speed this up or we'll never get out of here. I'm just going to throw up a few points on the private sector, which is to say they're kind of MIA, missing in action in a lot of these discussions. Everybody in development, I'm being very general here, but a lot of folks in development want to turn to the private sector. It's the engine, it's the motor of growth. It's the vibrant, dynamic sector. Yeah, but hold on. At least in the sub-Saharan African context, you can't say it's somehow separate from the state, especially where you have these kind of neo-patrimonial regimes, which are predatory states and very much linked to, enmeshed with the private sector and not in a healthy way. And that goes to the second point, crony capitalism. And then even where there is a private sector that has a greater degree of autonomy, where are they in terms of supporting civil society? Where are they in terms of, serving as a check to the state to see that there is greater inclusion, there is greater political competition? So this is the stuff that I had to do because I was writing an academic paper. I got to go back and sort of figure out, well, who's defining civil society and how? And this is by no means exhaustive, but these are some of the definitions that I found to be more useful, which leads me to this main point, which is, it seemed to me that a lot of the literature on civil society was still really stuck on who is civil society or what is civil society and where is it located. You hear about, well, it's all the space in between the household or the family and the state. Well, no, actually it's between this and that and the other thing. Whatever. I thought much more interesting is not what it is, who it is, or where it is, but what does it do? And that gets to the sort of functional definition that I'm going to walk you through in a few slides. But how I would define it would be those last two bullet points. Again, civic engagement, and then being able to catalyze collective action based on that civic engagement. So the functions, as I define them, come from a wonderful piece that was written by a husband and wife team, Poffenholz and Spurt, about 4 years ago. And there they are. I'm going to define them in just a moment, so don't worry, I'll get to that. But this particular book was written more in the context of civil society and peace building, which is similar to, but not the same as, governance. And so what I'm going to try to do is adapt things a bit so that these functions are operationally defined more for governance. And in particular, if we're going to get back to the original issue of development effectiveness, this is the question that I was asked to explore, which is how can development assistance actually engage citizens in civic action and then through civil society, through collective action, be able to support social justice. Okay? So here's how I'm going to go ahead and hand over what I actually ended up coming up with. I'll first try to define those functions. I'll try to describe what that looks like, what those look like in the sub-Saharan African context, and then provide some recommendations in this ABC framework. For anybody who's taken some peace building courses, looks an awful lot like, it should look an awful lot like, John Paul Lederach's strategic triangle, right? So we got bottom up, middle out, top down, right? Great. So first of all, I'm sort of giving you the punchline first. This is what ultimately we're going to be getting at. If we were to use the strategic triangle, this is how we would flank it and the various kinds of areas or functions of governance, and where the functions of civil society would be contributing to. So strengthening governance there, I guess that would be on your right, and inclusion on the left, and at the bottom, and for me, it's no coincidence, consensus, which is all about building social cohesion and its precursor, socialization around certain key values and behaviors. So again, here's John Paul Lederach's strategic triangle. That's what was on the inside of the previous triangle. We got, top-down institutional reform. That's always supplied by the state because they're the ones with the authority to do that. Bottom-up, we have, the demand for good governance and reform. And then those two components are what you typically see in, donor-funded governance and or civil society projects. You got top-down, bottom-up. Great. But what I think is neat about what the peace-building field brings in is this notion of middle-out. Now, in the donor-funded projects, they do talk about, building a constituency for reform, but they really don't talk about how you do that. I think that's what's nice about peace-building is that middle-out approach or component to the strategy that gets you there. So let's start with protection. And the way I define protection in the governance context is something that hopefully will resonate with some of you here as law students. Protection in the peace building or the humanitarian spheres looks much more on just what it sounds like. You're making sure that civilians are protected from both the sort of larger violent conflict as well as from any malfeasance by the implementers on the ground in how they're carrying out delivery of humanitarian assistance. But in the governance context, for me, it's much more about safeguarding the gains that you will hopefully have made in doing your civil society strengthening and in your work in trying to strengthen the institutions of governance. Okay? And the context in sub-Saharan Africa, why that's important, is has everyone heard the expression rule of law? Yeah? That's why you're here in law school. But rule by law, is anybody familiar with what that's all about? So it's the intentional effort of the state to set up structures, legal frameworks, such that it chokes off the opportunity for inclusion, the opportunity for political competition, the possibility of downward accountability. And it's, what we saw in places like closer to home here in Venezuela, where, for instance, some people's criticism of the Chavez regime was, it's great that they're finally reaching out to and including segments in the population that had heretofore been excluded, but meanwhile, it's setting up media laws and other structures such that, people no longer have the opportunity to be able to get their voices heard in any kind of a meaningful way. It's this kind of examples we've seen in the more authoritarian regimes in sub-Saharan Africa, where you might have NGO registration laws that the registration decision is made by people who work for security sector forces rather than people who actually know or care anything about civil society. Anywho, the recommendations, I'm not going to go through all of them. You can see, A is bottom up, B is middle out, C is top down. Here are a few ideas that I'm throwing out there. And again, what we're really trying to get at is being able to build upon the indigenous institutions that already exist, where it's possible to formalize them, to mainstream them into the statutory structures that are there. And a lot of that has to do, as you can see there, with ADR, Alternative Dispute Resolution. It can mean anything from mediation to community conferencing to all kinds of interesting forms of restorative justice. I've been mentioning accountability a lot, and here's how I understand accountability to work. And again, the context in sub-Saharan Africa, I've mentioned predatory state, I've mentioned neo-patrimonial regimes. Something I worked on quite a bit before coming into CRS was corruption. When you're looking at systemic corruption, where it isn't just a question of a few bad apples, and it's not just a question of a rotten barrel of apples, it's the barrel makers themselves and the apple growers. All right, I think I covered everybody there. So again, the recommendations, I focus a lot on social accountability because in civil society, that's pretty much, that's what we got to work with. And ultimately, we would like to be seeing at the top level pressures for, greater downward political accountability. Advocacy and public communication tied very much so to the monitoring and accountability. Again, this this is pretty tough. I mean, people who are in African civil society organizations that engage in advocacy also do so at their own risk. And I mean, not just professional careers, but their own, literally, their existence, their physical security. So this is no small thing. One thing I would mention at the end there with the recommendation at C is looking at, how we can work through the church, and by that I mean the Catholic Church, because in some countries you'll see an institution called the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office, which can be a place where we can be strengthening our church partners to be able to, channel citizen voice into very high-level policy discussions. Socialization. This is also referred to in governance as civic or voter, or you fill in the blank, education, public legal education. Getting people to, first of all, understand their rights under the law, and also understand their civic obligations, which may not be under the law, but certainly if you want rights, you need to be able to carry your own weight. And this is one way of educating people how to be able to fulfill their civic obligations. And when I talk about applied civic education, what I mean is we should not be going into developing country contexts to give people these sort of ninth grade civics classes and, this is a citizen's rights and this is what the state government does and this is blah, blah, blah. Whatever. They don't have time for that. What they are interested in is, how do I make sure that I can access the government's extension agent when I need him or her to provide me with technical support? How can I make sure that when I go to the local health center that they're speaking a language that I can understand, et cetera, and so forth? Or if I'm a civil society or community-based organization, a rural cooperative, trying to get my registration, I know what that government official on the other side of the desk is obligated to do, what services he must or she must perform for me if I got all my papers in order. Building social cohesion. This is the big one for peace building. This is what we talk about, right? Is trying to work across these social or economic cleavages so that people have a greater sense of sort of common identity and are less likely to try to resolve their disputes through violence. And this is something which I think is critically important for governance too, because my working hypothesis is, how can you strengthen governance if people are too busy tearing at each other's throats? That's not to say first one, then the other all the time, but at least initially, where do you start? And how do you create that sort of virtuous circle where greater social cohesion is giving you the space to then strengthen governance, which then creates a more enabling environment where people are more willing to use the structures and the processes for dispute resolution rather than lapsing into violence and exiting the civic arena. Bless you. So this other one, intermediation and facilitation, this is another one that might be interesting, I think, for folks here at the law school. Again, it's negotiating, helping citizens to negotiate their way in their relationship with the state. And that could be something as simple as paralegal assistance. I got a problem. I got a legal problem. And these courts are just inaccessible to me. They don't speak the language I speak. There's a huge waiting line. The case backlog is yada, yada, yada till forever. What do I do? It could also be, again, trying to, besides advocacy, maybe more in policy dialogue, trying to channel that citizen voice to policymakers so that they hear it. Okay? And then lastly, here's the one that organizations such as mine, Catholic Relief Services, are all too familiar with. And what I would say is what the authors of this study, Paffenholz and Spirk, say, which is, this is a great place to start, but don't fool yourself that somehow you're going to get institutional change or transformation just through this. It's your entry point. And by all means, hunker down if you have to, get some good work done if you can, but don't get stuck there. Okay? But there's ways that we can make it more sort of oriented towards governance, and that's increasing participation of private sector actors in service delivery. Sometimes that's not even an option, given a lot of these countries' budget situations, and now mandates is sort of imposed by the multilateral development banks. That's a necessity, but I think also, what we're really looking for, if we're talking more on the governance side, is making sure that in decentralization, there's also fiscal decentralization, that the subnational government units now have the authority to be able to generate local source revenue, and they're not just depending upon these allocations that are coming from the national government. Because what I found in my experience in a lot of these sub-Saharan African countries is the law of gravity does not apply. What goes up in terms of head tax revenue to the national government does not come back down in terms of allocation. And that's unfortunate, but that's part of the whole issue of corruption. So some of the conclusions that I'm coming up with here are, as I said earlier, let's not talk so much about aid effectiveness. I'm not saying that we shouldn't talk about it, but we shouldn't just talk about it. Obviously, if I'm a public donor like a USAID or a DFID or an EU, I care very much about this. I don't begrudge them that at all. However, if what you're really about is producing relevant, sustainable, effective, and impactful outcomes, does anybody know what those buzzwords are coming from? Impact, sustainability, relevance, effectiveness, efficiency. Ding, ding, ding. Give this man a prize. You get another bag of chips. Absolutely. I mean, then you really do need to be looking at, what it is you're actually producing, and then figuring out how you want to measure that. What's important to you when you talk about effective? Well, it might also mean equity. It might also mean, based on equity, inclusion. Equitable for whom, right? So others are to, when you want to strengthen civil society, I listed how many? 7 functions. Not every civil society actor is going to be able to do everything really well. And just like we talk about in private sector, specialization, division of labor, so too, I believe, civil society organizations would be a lot better off if they tried to specialize and determine what they do best and do that really well and just focus on that. And then lastly is to look at, as I've been trying to say throughout, civil society is but one institution among many within the sort of larger democracy and governance set of institutions. And so connecting what we do more intentionally and more equitably, and I'll describe that in a second, to the larger democracy and governance outcomes that you're trying to achieve. And what I mean by more equitably is there are standalone civil society strengthening projects, but they are now far and fewer between. And what you see usually and more often is these sort of larger governance projects that have a civil society strengthening component. And I'm telling you, from my experience, that component is like the kid who doesn't get picked on the street touch football team. I mean, they just sort of are, yeah, we'll take Jimmy, whatever, bring him along. And it's unfortunate that it's an afterthought because, civil society, for better or for worse, often is a way of making sure you have real, and I would say durable local ownership, because these are the organizations that have more frequent and I would say more profound interaction with citizens. It is not the state for a whole list of reasons. That's another subject of another presentation. And so you want to include them in a meaningful way. And not just as a sort of afterthought where here you go, here's a $50,000 grant, now go sort that corruption problem out. It just doesn't work that way. All right, so how does that look like? Well, thank you, Bill Gates and whoever, for giving me this cute little diagram that allows me to try to conceptualize a little bit where we might start. So I would start up here in the upper right-hand corner. And the reason why is my general approach to doing this kind of work is what I call an inside-out approach, or making sure you're walking your talk, right? So if we want to work with civil society organizations, I put community-based organization, but you could call it CSO, whatever. Make sure that you're strengthening all of their internal functions really, really well. Internal governance, financial and administrative management, so that they are able to walk the talk of accountability and transparency, because that gives them a lot more credibility and confidence to be able to go to this next little quadrant. Where are you? Oh, doggone it. The bottom right-hand corner there. Looking at local governance, or let's just call it subnational governance, just in case you're thinking just the lowest level of governance. I could be talking about provincial all the way down to, village level. The point being, if they go to local level officials and they say, hey, we can do it, so can you, that's a lot better than just stamping their feet and shaking their fists and saying, you're a bunch of no good, corrupt so-and-sos. Because often what you do see, maybe not at the local level, but certainly the national level, is the national government saying, oh yeah, well we did a little bit of investigation and it turns out you guys ain't so good yourselves. And now you've lost all credibility and it makes it really hard for you to be able to get any kind of traction in these kinds of efforts. So if you do what you say you want them to do, that allows you to get to that bottom right-hand corner of pushing for more effective and equitable governance. Moving over here, that creates, again, the sort of enabling environment for and the credibility of local governance institutions so that people are more willing to use and work through those institutions, staying within the civic arena in order to address whatever it is that's dividing them, and instead, better yet, address and focus on what connects them. That's sort of the peace-building approach to governance, where we're doing people-to-people kinds of efforts, and I think that's perfectly applicable to our work in governance. And that gets to, have people seen this term thrown around in the past few years, resiliency? That's a big deal these days in areas of programming that you might think have nothing to do with governance. Things like food security, agricultural livelihoods, disaster risk reduction, all that kind of stuff. So, great, now you're firing on all those cylinders, which, again, reinforces group cohesion and really enables people to take these principles of governance to heart. And I'm going to admit a flub here, that's where we should have started. The upper left-hand corner, I'm sorry. Because if you want to start the inside out, it starts with adopting good governance practices, and that means the members of your organization, the members start demanding better functioning systems for your organization as a civil society organization, and that's where I started. I apologize, and probably what I really should be saying is, you start where the context tells you to start. It just depends, which is frustrating as heck. But there is no one-size-fits-all formula. But I just want, hopefully, at least in my kind of flubby way, to show how there's a virtuous circle that we can and should be enabling with our programming efforts if we're going to strengthen civil society and if we're going to contribute to more effective development outcomes. That's all I got. Thank you.
So let's open up the floor.
So how much does CRS work on the ground with indigenous independent trade unions?
Trade unions. I would say it depends on the region. In Latin America, quite a lot. We've done quite a bit of work with trying to make lemonade out of the lemons that were, CAPTA and the rest, and workers' rights, also related to that, migration of workers. I don't know the details, but I know people who would, and I could point you in that direction. But I think it's safe to say, especially in Central America and the Caribbean, we've done a fair amount with the sindicatos.
But not in Africa?
No. Sir?
Yeah, I was watching on TV, I think it was the CBS morning show yesterday. I don't know if you happened to catch it, but it had Bill Gates on there, and he was discussing the same subject. Maybe somebody in here saw the show, because I was had to do 3 things at once during that time. But I think he basically said the same thing that you were saying today. But I remember on it, he pointed to Mexico as a success story on giving aid, and he also said that just giving aid is not the answer, that you have to do more, and most importantly, to build up the economy of the countries, or even the economy of the local economy starting first.
Okay.
And also he stressed education very heavily.
Yeah.
On it. I didn't, he's got a report out, and it was on CBS. I'd like to try to find a copy of his report, or maybe go to the CBS Sunday show, or no, the CBS Morning Show yesterday might have it on, maybe on the internet, his interview.
So the point is, we got Bill Gates as a major actor in international development. Yes, he is. And his foundation puts out, I forget the figures, but it's pretty substantial. That, we need stronger economies and not just aid. Folks have been saying that for a long time, and I couldn't agree more. I would just, again, no one can really argue with that as such. That's all Development 101. The question is, stronger economy for whom, and how do you get there? Catholic Relief Services, which bases all of its efforts upon Catholic social teaching, is very clear. Option for the poor, we serve the most vulnerable. And, these very high-level reforms, such as, let's say, NAFTA, or, other kinds of efforts at the macroeconomic level, do not trickle down often to the most vulnerable. So I actually worked on the NAFTA, 20 plus years ago, from when I was working with the National Environmental Organization in the United States, and we were one of the 6 national environmental NGOs that were actually in favor of NAFTA. And I'm with it in theory. I absolutely am. From our perspective as environmentalists, you had to get on the train before it left the station, meaning, you had to support Mexico and its efforts to develop economically in order for it to have an incentive to be able to be willing to strengthen its environmental policies and its enforcement regimes and all that good stuff. I've been out of touch and disconnected from that particular set of issues too long to be able to weigh in. But I think other people here who have experience, with Mexico in general, or maybe more on environmental policy, international trade issues. But I think the devil's in the details is mainly what I would say. Yes, I'll come back to you.
How do you think aid organizations and NGOs can help strengthen civil societies in more unstable environments and governments without them being seen as, the government accusing them of creating conflict or creating, an incohesive state?
Right. So, my little filler. Hold on a second. I'll do it the old-fashioned way. All right, so there's 7 functions. And in that kind of context that you're talking about, I'll ask you the question, which of those functions, where would you start?
Well, I guess my question was, how do they support those functions without being seen as an enemy of the state?
Well, if I'm a civil society organization and I'm in an environment where there's an active violent conflict, I would imagine a good place for me not to start would be monitoring and accountability necessarily alone, because that would be seen as threatening. I'm not saying it's the wrong thing to do in general, but maybe in that particular environment. Maybe I'd want to focus more on protection. Maybe I'd want to focus more on building social cohesion. Protection, just setting some basic ground rules that we can all live with about ensuring that civilians are protected from the violence. And in terms of social cohesion, and this is a role the church plays all the time, the Catholic Church and other faith-based organizations, is, trying to bring together the conflict parties so that at least there can be some dialogue around, what would it look like to end the conflict, and then what do we do afterwards? And there are enough examples that I can think of off the top of my head where those are, if they're done well, seen as non-threatening. But I brought up this list of seven, the seven veils or whatever you want to call it, because it really is about the context, and it's about then choosing what your entry point, what's the appropriate entry point. Sir, and then young man over here.
Yeah, excuse me, I have a comment and a question. The comment is, excuse me, I need that extra chips. It's a word of thanks for something you've done, which I think is very creative, and that is, normally when I've seen presentations on governance and development, they've started from kind of models of governance, and occasionally peace building might get mentioned along the way as one aspect of governance, but it's kind of subsumed in a bigger theme. You've actually turned the tables here, not once but twice, and starting with peace building, and then moving out to governance as kind of derivative of peace building, and this is a good example of that. And I think that's a really interesting approach. I think peace builders would be thrilled to know that not only is their work being appreciated and recognized, it's actually foundational and being used to say things about governance, which is a nice turning of the tables from, say, 10 years ago, where you wouldn't have ever seen something like this done. And the question is actually completely separate from that, and that is, you mentioned at the beginning a little bit of criticism about the partnership model of how international NGOs work with locals.
Yeah.
And I mean, this has obviously been a big issue and been around for a while, but when you get to your recommendations at the end, it sounds like there's still a lot of international NGOs and international donors supporting local civil society. Right. And we all know how much of their budgets, nearly all of their money is coming from international donors for local civil society efforts. And I'm wondering how you think about that in terms of your framework, in terms of developing local civil society that's truly locally supported in a sense, and maybe even financially. So that it's not so much seen as in the hand or the pocket of the international donors. Because that seems like it's going to be critical for changing anything about governance. If civil society looks like an in for the international actors to influence governance, that creates a different sense than local civil society kind of doing this from its own, on its own in a sense.
So that's a great point. And, you know, there's been for, I don't know, the past 15, maybe 20 years, the discussion of more of a social enterprise model, right? Where it isn't just about, you know, the local NGO saying, you know, we'll make photocopies for you for 10 cents a pop, but actually setting themselves up in their whole, you know, model to do, what did they say, to do well by doing good, right? And there's opportunities for that. One example, I think, is some of the experience I had working with rural cooperatives in West Africa, where they, on their very own, decided to do two things, very important. First of all, they received no, you know, assistance, you know, directly as such. I mean, they received technical support, but that was about it. And they decided to allocate 10% of their profits to social good, you know, repairing that classroom, or rebuilding the community health post, or repairing the road, or something like that. But more interestingly is what we were getting to in that inside-out approach, is they basically said, you know, based on the training we've gotten and how to become better managers of our business, we realize that the same principles that apply to a private business should apply to a public structure like the community council. We have to manage our resources transparently and accountably, and so should you, because you're getting our resources. It's our taxes, it's our money. And that might sound a bit, you know, pie in the sky idealistic in a West African semi-authoritarian regime, but in fact, at that local level, it's possible. And the reason why is quite literally the village is a small place. The same people who were members of these rural cooperatives also happen to be elected members of the local councils. And so they were the ones who actually said, oh, whoa, wait, whoa. We need this same training that we're getting in our cooperative here at the local council. And just to sort of take you to the, you know, next few chapters of this story, at one point, the council presidents formed an association who then went to the paramilitary prefect, who, is appointed by the president. And they said, Mr. Prefect, you are responsible for the administration in this prefecture. And when we go to try to register our local rural cooperatives, they're being told there's a photocopying fee or there's a this or that, petty corruption. So we don't mind going back to the cooperatives and saying, you got to pay, but please show us in the law where it says they got to pay. And so that was private sector acting as a civil society actor, helping to improve governance, because of course the prefect was in a good way shamed into doing the right thing. That's sort of the end of that little story. Now how you get that scaled up and affecting national level institutions, that's an interesting discussion. I'm not sure, we got like 10 minutes left, but I'm happy to carry it out afterwards. Yes, sir.
Can you just say a few words about some of the challenges that you found in working with civil society on the monitoring and evaluation component, and whether you've had successes in terms of being able to measure more than just outputs in terms of number of people trained with them and have gotten to outcomes?
Yeah. Now they're saying go beyond outcomes and measure impact. So the challenges are M&E can be really tough. It's tough for us at Catholic Relief Services, and we're a multi-gazillion-dollar international NGO. And it's tough because we see it as tough, and we don't realize actually if you do a few simple things really well, you'll be in good shape. I think what works well to address that is, in our lexicon of working with civil society organizations and partners more generally, we talk about capacity building, we talk about institutional capacity strengthening, and we talk about accompaniment. Capacity building is more at the individual or small team level, right? And then there's institutional capacity strengthening, which gets at, making sure that this core function of any organization is being strengthened, and that there are systems and structures in place. Okay, they're in place, but now what? Accompaniment is where we have our staff that actually go out of the capital city country program office and literally sit with, walk with, work with these local partners to show them, remember we had this workshop on blobbity bloop? Well, here's how you do blobbity bloop. And let's work together to make sure that you feel more confident in your ability to do that. In terms of achieving outcomes, I don't know if that, it's hard to generalize if that approach has been able to improve outcomes. Certainly it's improved the efficiency with which we're doing monitoring and evaluation. But as I was alluding to earlier, they've moved the goalposts on us. And now we have to be looking at impact, which, boy, that's a whole other can of worms. Back here, sir.
Yeah, what is your position on democracy promotion? You kind of glossed over it a little bit, but is it something that is just so politically sensitive that it's impossible to do it, even though you might like to, or is it something you don't want to do, or is it something that you think you're doing, even though you call it by different names, by promoting civil society or accountability or something?
Right.
Or do you think it's just something that's kind of in the future that you have to lay the groundwork for it and eventually it will happen?
Sort of as I was saying earlier, it's an area of work that kind of got a bad name over the past few years, just because, not that it ever was all that different, but democracy and governance promotion has always been seen as what person who asked about social enterprise, right here, about making sure that this isn't just the donors trying to get their beaks into internal affairs. And also it's been seen as, just a lot of perfume going on the pig, you know what I mean? And I think the reaction of the donors has been, okay, you're saying it's politicized, we'll make it more technical. Well, the problem with that is you're still trying to address political challenges. You cannot solve what is fundamentally a political problem with a technical solution, because it really all comes down to power. Who has it, how much, and how they're using it, and to what end. And so I would say, to get more to your question, what do I feel about it? I think if you're addressing those fundamental issues of power so that more people have access to it and the structures that make decisions and allocate resources, you want to call it democracy promotion, I'm all for it. I think it is better to do the sort of Trojan horse approach of, as you raise the question, making sure you're respectful of the sensitivities depending on the context, whether it's violent conflict or just a fundamentally insecure, semi-authoritarian regime. You have to be mindful of that and do what you have to do in order to be effective and be able to stick around. I think, as I also mentioned, because democracy and governance programs have now sort of left doing more civil society strengthening on its own and instead just try to integrate a component within larger governance programs, what's getting lost is that more fundamental issue of addressing power structures and dynamics. And I think that's really unfortunate because you'll get a lot of nice reports that have been produced by your implementing organization. I'm not sure you've really gotten, though, any progress in changing those, fundamental issues. So, 1, 2, 3.
I was a little bit surprised by your comment that you don't want to, it's fine to do service, but don't just end at service. And I would think that for a lot of NGOs, that's the beginning and the end of what they're supposed to do. That's their mission statement. That's their purpose in life. And they don't want to try to make institutional reform. They want to literally, bring care and love and cold water to the people in need and that are hurting. And so, don't you mean to say that some civil society organizations should just do that, like many other civil society organizations do more institutional systemic change?
I think that's exactly what I mean to say, and I also would sort of say what I said earlier, that if you want to do civil society strengthening, if you want to do a program that's really going to have an opportunity to do transformational change, it can't just stop at service delivery. 2 and then 3 back there.
I'm from Uzbekistan, and Uzbekistan is one of the plastic governments, and we have few international NGOs inside the country, and they are only working because they are following conditions of government, which is not touching those sensitive issues. And it's good from one side that they're at least doing something. It's also bad because they are kind of losing trust of people for NGOs, for civil society, because people see them as one picture of government. And I work for an NGO who acts from outside country, and it's been so hard to build trust with people because they think we are also, work for government or one side of government.
Right.
We are like, watching them. So how do you think, what should they do? Stop working or continue doing at least something?
Oh boy. So Islam Karimov is still your fearless leader, huh? Yeah. I was there about 10 years ago, and we were probably part of that problem that you're illustrating. I worked for an organization that had a huge civil society strengthening program. Although what we tried to do was this sort of cascade effect of strengthening, national consortia, which then would strengthen intermediate support organizations, which would then strengthen community-based organizations. I get what you're saying, that the continued presence of international NGOs there, only to do these sort of, politically non-threatening interventions just gives credibility to the government and also actually creates a distance with the people whom they're there ostensibly to serve. I don't have an easy answer for you. Should they continue to do work or not? From a humanitarian perspective, if there's a need, they should. But let's not fool ourselves about what we're actually accomplishing. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer. Yes, please.
Yeah,
I'll come back.
I also worked in a local NGO in Sierra Leone, and at least I've identified 2 problems which I believe explains why aid does not reflect on the local people. Oftentimes, donor agencies have their own set of goals, and the local NGOs too have their own set of goals, which do not necessarily match or do not always match. So local NGOs are forced, at least in my case, to tailor their goals to suit donor requirements.
Yeah.
And this does not reflect on the realities, it's different from the realities on the ground. For example, I worked in an organization that provide basic justice services through community-based paralegals. We're one of the only organizations in Sierra Leone that does that. So any international NGO that has justice and the rule of law as part of its goals would come to our organization, but then they would want us to tailor certain things, like abandon certain things in order to fit the goals of that organization, which in a way it reduces the aim of the local NGO, because we are on the ground, we know the reality of the situation, and we know what the people require.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you want money. And who says no to money when your organization is in need of money? So you're forced to tailor whatever you do in order to fit the donor's requirements. That, I believe, is one reason why most NGOs fail in developing countries. The other reason I've identified is that sometimes the NGOs do not have the capacity to handle the kind of money that is being pumped in. Yeah, so this big agency would come and say, look, we have $400,000 for you and you have to use this within a year. Yeah, it's such a short period of time. In a way, they're also encouraging corruption. This is a lot of money. I can't say no to it. So, okay, we have to make, let's put things in place to show that we can indeed use this money.
Yeah.
And if they ended up not using the money, then you have to give back. You don't want that to happen.
Right.
That encourages corruption. So what would you suggest is way forward? How do we...
Oh, you're saving all the easy questions. Oh my gosh. By the way, I'm willing to stay overtime if we still have the room, if that's okay. So I got no problems with that. I don't have an easy answer to your questions, because what you described is a reality, and not just in Sierra Leone, but in many countries. The unrealistic timeframes in which donors expect results, the lack of absorptive capacity, not only of civil society groups, but even when the World Bank comes in with these massive decentralization projects, and they're initially giving grants of $50,000 to local district governments that are used to, at best, poorly managing $2,000 or $3,000 a year. Are you kidding me? These are all issues. And the other issue I thought you were going to raise is, if I'm a small local NGO and I've got a limited staff and they're all busy doing the work that they need to be doing for us to achieve our mission, if we're given a grant by the donor or by the international group as a sub-grant, we're told, you can't hire new staff, this money is just for programming. Well, I'm supposed to take my staff away from doing mission-critical work so I can do your bidding? But like you said, how can I say no to money? It's really hard. But I got good news, there are NGOs that have. When I worked in Uganda with it was a USAID-administered Millennium Challenge Corporation-funded Threshold Country Program on anti-corruption, the Ugandan network basically said, phooey to youey, we don't want your money. We got everybody fully engaged doing what they're supposed to be doing. And frankly, all the administrative rigmarole you make us go through just to take your money isn't worth it to us. So I guess it's kind of a hard response to your question, but if you don't like the rules of the game, then don't play the game. And find other ways that your NGO can generate revenue. A gentleman here talked about trying to take a more social enterprise approach where you can, I'm translating from French, so rentabilize, your intervention so that there's greater citizen demand for what you're having to offer, even if it's just a small amount. I mean, this is the example I learned working with these rural cooperatives. They are willing to pay for services if they see that the services are valuable. And so one of the things I'm taking a side path here, but one of the things we do at Catholic Relief Services really, really well is microfinance. And the very people whom you would say have no chance of coming up with any kind of spare cash to do, meaningful development work or social work, in fact, they do, through what we call savings and internal lending communities, where we go to the most vulnerable, usually women, and they form these groups that do savings and lending with each other. And there's usually like a sort of social fund that allows them to do important work in their community. So I'm not saying that's the answer, but I'm just saying there are possibilities out there that need to be explored. There's Miss Young.
Yes, I also used to work with the international NGO in China. And one thing makes me start to question and suspicious about NGO work is NGO never feel, especially international NGO. I think because they give money, they get money from donor and then they give money, can cooperate with the local NGOs. And local NGOs want to get money again, get project again, so they cannot say, okay, this project failed. And the international NGOs also need to report to the donors, and they also cannot say it failed. And you can see in the international NGOs that they have a good structure system to do the monitoring, evaluation. But you always say good report, and this project is very good, we achieved a lot. That project is good, we achieved a lot. Never failed. But I don't believe something is like always succeed, never failed. So I think it's like the structure or systematic problem of this field. Like you said, it's the game of this, it's a rule of this game. So I think this rule has some problems. So I want to know what you think about.
So there are, now there's, more talk about being more honest and open about failure and learning from failure. So when we talk about monitoring and evaluation, we also talk about accountability and learning. Although when you read some of these, project reports or evaluations, there's always going to be this lessons learned section, and they're the most anodyne bits of tripe I've ever had to read through. Oh my God. I mean, participation is important. Yeah, all right. Tell me something I don't know. And I think, though, that doesn't mean to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can't just dismiss entirely the need to be looking at where you've fallen short and what exactly were the challenges and what did you do to try to overcome the challenges. And maybe, I don't know how we can make the public donors more receptive to receiving that information so that the NGO writing the report doesn't feel insecure that, oh my God, I just exposed myself. Now they're never going to fund me for another project again. I think, though, that public donors are becoming more receptive because they need to learn from us. I mean, we're the ones who are front line. We're the ones who are doing the work, and if we present it in such a way that we're not just, rapping them on the knuckles and criticizing them, but saying, no, really, these are some real operational challenges, or, you know what, we found this aspect of the design probably not as relevant as it should have been. And if we're doing solid monitoring and evaluation work to be able to bring up those issues, I think there's a higher likelihood that they'll be more receptive.
Aaron, thank you very much. I think you'll have about 10 minutes to stick around.
Okay.
For people who want to ask more questions, so please join me in thanking you.
You're not?
No, I was.
How are you?
And
just came over here to stare at